Every one of us has our own unique story, full of twists and turns, mountains and valleys, and positive and negative points. Underneath your story, God's grace shows up at work in your life, calling you towards something great, whether it's big or small. Your story isn't alone. Woven into your unique story is your community, other people's stories, and the story of God's family, the church. Join us for this 3-week series as we share our stories, our Jesus stories, our call stories, and our church stories.
I stood alone in the kitchen of the restaurant where I worked. It was early, still dark outside, and the other staff hadn't yet arrived. And for the first time in months, I prayed. God, Saturday is hard. And you might be wondering why I prayed about Saturday. I'm going to come back to that in a few minutes. But God replied with 2 simple words that were so much more than the sum of their parts. I know. My name is Michal White, and most of you have gotten the chance to meet me or see my videos by now, but I always find it helpful to say my name one more time so that people can get the hang of its pronunciation. It's Michal. It rhymes with Michelle. Michelle, Michal, Michelle, Michal. It's Michal. I was recently hired to be the new pastor of the South Lansing campus of Sycamore Creek. Although for at least a few months, Pastor Tom and I will be leading together as he shows me the ropes and mentors me in this position. And speaking of Tom, I just want to take a moment to thank him and the other folks who have brought me here today. There was a team of people who were part of the interview team. They read through pages and pages of my personal profile, of questions that I was asked. They came up with thoughtful questions to ask me and gave me the chance to get a glimpse into the values of Sycamore Creek. They really put in a lot of work, and I'm thankful for their dedication to the future of the church. I also want to mention the vision team, who serve the church in various seen and unseen ways, and who were also part of me joining the team here. I'll share more in a couple of weeks about how exactly I wound up here in Lansing, but I just want to thank them for their part in my story. And I especially want to thank you for the warm welcome that you have given us. You've brought us so many meals. We've had so much good food. You showed up and helped us unload our moving truck. It was unloaded in less than an hour. You welcomed my parents when they were visiting while they were here, and I can tell you right now that we are going to love Lansing. I shared a brief moment of my Jesus story to open. It's from 2014, the year of restoration that followed a year from hell. But my Jesus story began much earlier than that. I grew up in a Christian family. We were part of a small denomination called the Christian and Missionary Alliance. It is a denomination deeply committed to overseas missions and bringing the gospel to people who have never heard. Our church was small and dedicated. There was a core group of families who seemed to do everything together. We were in Sunday school together. We were homeschooled together. We lived in each other's homes for everything from birthday parties to New Year's and Super Bowl parties. And I'll share more next week about how this church community shaped my sense of calling. But it was here that I first experienced Jesus. In middle school and high school, I participated in a Bible quizzing team where I memorized long passages of scripture and began to practice living out my faith. On the whole, I would say my family was quite legalistic. We're very focused on how to live the right way, like you don't have sex before you're married, you don't lie, you don't gossip, you stay respectful to adults, even when they're terrible, don't go into debt, save everything, on and on and on. And so when I graduated from high school, I went to college the right way. I quickly joined a campus ministry. My sister was a senior at that college. It was East Carolina University. So I went to the group where she was involved in, the right group, InterVarsity Christian Fellowship. InterVarsity quickly became my people. They were my friend group, my accountability group, my small group. I began to lead in ways there that I had never led before. I learned how to lead a small group and a team of people. I looked for ways to reach out to people who didn't know Jesus and have spiritual conversations. I discipled friends and other students. I like to say that growing up, we were pretty legalistic, and it was in college that I learned about grace. And then I added it to my list of things to do the right way. I attempted to trust the right way, forgive the right way, and live the right way, which might sound good in theory, but in practice, it meant that I was often scared to take a risk because I was afraid I would do something the wrong way. And it pushed down any emotions that I perceived as negative, things like anger, fear, and sadness, because in my mind, they reflected a lack of faith or trust in God. They weren't the right way to follow Jesus. InterVarsity was also the place where I met my husband, Nathan. We served together on a mission trip to Romania with InterVarsity the summer after my freshman year in college. He was at Virginia Tech, and I was at ECU. We were on the trip for 4 weeks and became good friends. We started dating about 6 weeks after the trip ended, and we got married right after I graduated college. We were basically babies. We thought we had the world figured out, but we had so much maturing to do. Early on, some things that happened damaged trust between us. And because I was trying so hard to do life the right way, I didn't fully process what was happening. I just pushed down those emotions. I thought the right way to deal with difficult emotions was to ignore them and focus on the positive. I became disconnected from myself. I was disconnected from my emotions because I knew in my mind the right way to do things. A few years later, we had our first son, and then our second son about a year and a half later. Those years were tough. Recently, someone who had just had a baby asked me how I survived those early years, and I told her there are whole years I don't remember. I was tired all the time. I cried a lot. In those early years, I was beginning to recognize that no matter how hard I tried to control things and parent the right way, there were certain things that were out of my control. I couldn't wave a magic wand to keep my kid from throwing a fit at the train table at the Barnes & Noble. I couldn't force my child to share. I couldn't really do anything when they were at preschool. I remember processing motherhood with a mentor from the church, and I said something like, "The mark of my success as a mother isn't whether I have children who obey." My conclusion at the time was that success would look like having kids who follow Jesus. This mentor essentially told me I was wrong, and that successful motherhood is obedient children. She went on to say that when I punished my children, I should do so until I saw their wills break in their eyes. And I was beginning to recognize that this just wouldn't work for my kids, and I felt confused and disoriented. Like, is this really the way to be faithful to God? Over the next few months, stretching into the next few years, this question got more and more poignant. I began to receive reports from my kids' preschool teachers that they were struggling. I won't go into all the details because this isn't really my story to tell, but for the better part of a year, we were wrestling with systems to get evaluations and the services that we needed to thrive. And during that same year, underscoring this reorientation of my life and parenting, we were experiencing a kind of loss that I was previously unfamiliar with. This is the year we call the year from hell. It was 12 months, March 2013 to March 2014. It started with one of my kids being referred for some evaluations, and there was also a church-wide fast that led up to Easter. It was a partial food fast called the Daniel Fast, and it coincided with a sermon series on miracles and how you just have to have faith to get God to move on your behalf. Now, you only know me as a pastor, but at this point in my story, I wasn't a pastor. In fact, I didn't even believe women could be pastors. I was working as a baker at a local restaurant. And like the good Christian girl that I was, we participated in this fast the right way, wholeheartedly. Fasting the right way was challenged a bit when I found out 2 weeks into this 3-week fast that I was pregnant with our third baby. I modified the fast to ensure that I was getting good nutrition. And then partway through that final week, I started to feel off. And I went into my doctor. She let me know that I was likely miscarrying, and they did some blood work to confirm it. That afternoon, she gave me a call to let me know that my hormone levels were higher than they expected and that they needed to track them. Typically, they would take blood every other day, but that second day would have been Good Friday and they were closed. And all my brain heard when she called me was atypical pregnancy. I thought, there's hope. I had grown up in conservative evangelicalism. As a child, I attended pro-life rallies, and I heard all kinds of stories about miracle babies. Stories where doctors had told parents their baby would die at birth, and the doctor suggested that the woman have an abortion. And then the parents prayed really, really hard, and the baby was born healthy. I thought, this is going to be our big Easter story where we thought there was death, but then there was life. I thought about how the disciples, for them, Jesus' death seemed final, and then it wasn't. I was sort of like the guy on Dumb and Dumber who asked the woman, what are the chances they'll wind up together? And she says, 1 in a million. And he's like, so you're saying there's a chance? I figured I just had to believe the right way and pray the right way and get the right people to pray the right way with me, and everything would be fine. My faith will be stronger. And then Monday came, and the blood work confirmed a miscarriage. I was devastated for a while, and then I stuffed my emotions and I tried to move on the right way. A few months later, we tried again. I got pregnant quickly and went in right away for blood work. And I had to go back every 2 days to see if my hormones were rising the way that they were supposed to. And every time they were rising, but not as much as they should have been. And so I had to go back and back and back. And I tried to pray the right way. I asked my small group to pray with us. I tried to be surrendered, but then also full of faith that God would act. And this went on for 2 agonizing weeks until they confirmed that I had miscarried a second time. In retrospect, I think that if I hadn't miscarried, I would have fully believed that there was a right way to produce the results that I wanted. I'm not thankful that I miscarried, but I am thankful I learned the lesson that you can't control how God moves. And this happened in the same month where my other son turned 2. We were struggling to communicate with him, and he was also referred from some evaluations. In the fall, my older son received a diagnosis, and my boys were kicked out of their church preschool because the administration was convinced that they wouldn't be able to accommodate them. And this was about the same time as the due date of the first baby that we miscarried. And then in March 2014, my other son received the same diagnosis the day before the due date of the second baby we lost. And so to recap, in 12 months, we had 2 miscarriages, 2 diagnoses, and a whole lot of heartache. Now, before I go any further, I want to say very clearly that I wouldn't change a thing about my kids. What was hard about that year was the loss of the babies and my own letting go of what I thought parenthood would be and how I interacted with my peers. A lot of well-meaning people had opinions about my kids and about my parenting that were hurtful. They didn't think I was doing things the right way. A lot of well-meaning people had opinions about why I miscarried, like everything happens for a reason, or God knew I couldn't handle another baby right then. By December of 2013, I was hurting and my heart was hard. I remember being caught off guard by how painful Christmas was. I couldn't handle the anticipation of a baby, even if that baby was the Messiah. I very nearly swore off God altogether when a pastor said that God blesses people like Mary because they're faithful. I thought, if God blesses people because they're faithful, does that mean people who don't have blessings, people who experience things like miscarriage, are being punished for unfaithfulness? If that's who God really is, I'm out. I don't want anything to do with that kind of God. But I couldn't just walk away. Partly because I couldn't imagine myself being anything other than a Christian. I was invested in being the person who does things the right way. And partly because my husband was working in ministry. I wish I could say it was something deeper than that, but I really think that's why I did the work that came next. I took a few months off church. Well, I took a few months off Sunday mornings. I stayed connected with my small group. They knew what we were going through, and I knew that I could be honest with them. I couldn't handle the well-meaning and hurtful Christians who showed up with cliches on Sunday mornings. I couldn't handle the harmful teachings on blessings. And I just needed space to cry and yell at God. So Nathan took the boys to church on Sunday mornings, and I stayed home and I blogged and cried and yelled. There were two things that were especially helpful during that time. First, I read C.S. Lewis's book, A Grief Observed. This is his published journal from the time after his wife died. His grief gave me permission to ask the questions I needed to wrestle with. Remember how I was disconnected from my emotions because I knew the right answers? Well, he helped me process those emotions. I needed to know, is God really good? Can I trust God? If God's all powerful, did he cause this? And if God didn't cause it, why didn't he stop it from happening? And the second thing that helped me was a series of talks that Nathan shared with me after he went to a staff conference for InterVarsity. These talks from John Ortberg introduced me to this idea that all throughout Scripture, there are third-day stories. Stories where something bad happens on day one, and on the third day, there's a great reversal. You know, like how Jonah was swallowed by the fish, and then 3 days later, he came out on dry land. And of course, the biggest third-day story is Easter. On day one, on Friday, Jesus dies. The worst thing that could ever happen happens, and all hope seems gone. Jesus, who is God in the flesh, who came to earth and lived among us, voluntarily dies. And then on day 3, there's Easter. Jesus comes back to life, and we find out that hope is not gone at all. There's victory. But Saturday, that day in between, is the day after the worst has happened, when you still have to get up and go on with your life. Too often people live in one of two ways. They either live as if it's Friday, everything's terrible, there's no hope, nothing will ever change, or as if it's Sunday and the victory is here and we should be joyful and triumphant all the time. But what if we really live in a Saturday kind of world? Victory is coming and hope is real, but sometimes it doesn't feel like it. The story is still in process, and it's hard to hold on to hope. All seems lost. This concept helped me make sense of what I was experiencing. I was surrounded by Sunday folks who were rushing me through my grief and telling me that if I really trusted God, that this shouldn't be that hard. At this point, I hadn't been able to pray for a while. The conversation just didn't seem sincere. I was hurt and didn't know if I could trust God to be good. I was working at a restaurant as a baker. And then one morning in the kitchen, it was still dark outside. I was alone, not just in the kitchen, but in the restaurant. I stood over a table full of flour and dough, and I prayed a simple prayer. God, Saturday is hard. Now you know why I prayed about Saturday. And in my heart, I heard him say, I know. I felt so seen and cared for in that moment. I didn't have answers. Things weren't explained away, but I knew that he was grieving with me, and that went a long way. As I blogged and grieved on the Sunday mornings, I started to heal just a little. And then the women in my small group invited me to a women's conference. Tentatively, I agreed to go, but only on the condition that they would leave with me if the speaker said anything hurtful. Thankfully, the speaker was exactly the person I needed to hear from. But I remember that we sang that Chris Tomlin song, Christ is enough for me, your grace is enough for me. And I choked on the words. I couldn't say them, I didn't believe them. Christ wasn't enough for me. I wanted the babies I had lost. A few days after, I found out I was pregnant yet again. I spent some time in prayer with a trusted friend named Theo. This woman had been a support for me as I processed, someone I trusted who wasn't afraid of my anger and my questions. She worked for the church and offered something we called listening prayer. It was a time when she would prompt me to pray something. I would pray it out loud, and then I would report back whatever I saw, heard, or sensed. Essentially, we were acting on the assumption that the Holy Spirit is always speaking to us, and sometimes we just need to slow down and listen. Someone from my small group came along and prayed silently throughout our session just as a support. I told God that I was worried about what would happen to my spiritual life if I had yet another miscarriage, and He said, I am with you. I will never leave you or forsake you. And then He reminded me of the verse in Psalm 23 where David says, your goodness and mercy will follow me all the days of my life. And to be honest, I was like, that's kind of hard to believe because this past year hasn't felt like your goodness and mercy. And He said, I am your goodness and mercy. Theo prompted me to ask if there was anything else God wanted me to know about that. And He said, I am. It was an incredibly powerful moment. I was shaking. I thought to keep from crying, but I learned later that sometimes shaking is a sign of the presence of the Spirit. And when we debriefed after the session, Theo told me that it had been storming, but it got quiet at that moment, and there was such a presence in the room. She almost thought we needed to stop. Now, I'm not sure if that's the best interpretation of the passage of Psalm 23. I'm not sure that any other scholars are studying that chapter and coming to the conclusion that David is talking about God following him. But I can say that for me, this made so much sense. Even as I had been keeping Jesus at arm's length, grieving in the valley in the shadow of the deaths of my babies, He was following me. Over the next few weeks, I continued to process not only the experience of God's presence, but also the question of whether the grace of God is enough for me. The experience of the holiness and the heaviness and power of God's presence was hard for me to ignore. I sensed so much goodness and like bigness and mercy in God's presence. I wasn't yet ready to say, yes, God's grace is enough for me forever, but I started to be able to say, yes, God's grace is enough for me today. And I hoped that I would be able to say that more and more days and more weeks and months. And now, I don't follow Jesus because I think He brings me some kind of hocus pocus protection. I don't believe that I have to do things all the right ways in order to convince Jesus that He should love me and do what I want Him to do. I don't follow Jesus because I expect Him to make my jobs work out or my life work out. I follow Him because He's good and He's full of mercy. I follow Him because in Him I find a safe space to do my emotional work, and because I want to be more like Him. I want to be the kind of person who's full of mercy and holds space for other people to do their emotional work. And this has been the foundation of my Jesus story ever since. Permission to question, to wrestle, to change, to grow. Permission to not know the ending when I start out on the journey. Permission to be in process. I'm learning to trust that the God of the mountain is the God of the valley. And that even though I may never understand the ins and outs of why certain things happen on earth, and that sometimes it will seem like God is absent and silent, but because of that moment where God showed up undeniably for me, I can trust that God is good and present every step of the way. Saturday is still hard. Saturday sometimes still feels hopeless. Saturday sometimes feels like it will last forever. But I can trust that Sunday is coming.